All right, so this is the fourth video in the web component series. The first one we talked about how to build a web component and the content that you had inside of there. Second one was about styling them. Third one was about properties and attributes, so how you could add custom properties and attributes. And this final one is about behaviors and events. So when the web component is rendered or removed, if you're using JavaScript and you're adding a Big Bang component to the page, just like you'd add a paragraph to the page, how we can hook into that behavior, or when it's removed from the page, how you can hook into that and do stuff with it. We're also going to talk about events and functions and how you can actually pass functions in your code into your web component. So here we have our component, pretty much the same as what we had in the previous video about properties and attributes. I've got a background color. I've added a button here. So this is going to be rendered with a slot. I have a span with the text. That's my slot. So if I add a slot, so some kind of element with the slot attribute with the name done, this is going to be my text that's going to be put inside the button. If that is not there, then I don't want anything to appear on the screen. So if I remove this, what I want to have happen is I don't want any button to be there at all. So we're going to talk about doing that. We're also going to talk about how we can use an attribute to pass a function down into it. So in my Big Bang element here, here's the HTML that we're working with. So there's a div with an H1 heading, the slot for the title, and then there's a paragraph with a button, and here's that slot. So if the person has that slot, we want to put that inside of here. And if they don't have that slot, then we don't want to have this showing up on the screen, this button. We don't want that there at all. All right, so in our HTML extended constructor here, where we're creating the web component, this is where you can write some custom functionality to handle slots. So if the slot is added or changed, if the content inside the slot is changed, we can handle that here. If you've got custom events that you want to add, so event handling for the user interacting with this content, you can do that here. And we can also draw in values from the attributes. Now, I've already added the code here for an attribute called action. I've created the property to match that. So this is based on the previous video. Link to that's up at the top. We're going to take just a string. So in here, if I were to do this, if I was to say action equals, and in my main script, so here's my script for the page. You notice there's no type or defer or anything like that. I'm just linking to this script. Inside of here, I've got two functions. One called hello, one called goodbye. These are the functions that I want to call. These are functions that I've written as part of my web page. And I've imported, we're saying we've imported the Big Bang component. We've put it onto the page, but we want to be able to call one of our own functions when the user clicks the button. The button's being built by the web component, but we want to have one of our functions run when that happens. So here's the name, hello. We'll start with that. We'll take this name, hello, and we'll put it in here as the value of the action. So this is how we're going to connect the two things. We're going to take this value, and then we're going to say, hey, okay, we've got the name of the function that we want to run. How do we do it from inside of here? All right, so we're going to get to that in a moment. The other thing that we're going to add right here, we'll do this part first. It's fairly straightforward. With web components, when you extend the HTML element, there's two built-in methods. It's kind of the life cycle of the web component that we can draw on. One is called connected callback. The other one is disconnected callback. This first one gets called when the Big Bang element is added to the page. So this Big Bang thing in the HTML, when somebody puts it there, or in JavaScript, if they're saying create element Big Bang and then append to the page. So when it's added to the DOM, when it's added to the page itself, that triggers this. And this one gets triggered when the Big Bang element is removed from the page. So we're getting rid of the Big Bang element. And we're going to look at examples of that as well. So right now, let's just put a console log in here. Okay, and there's the added to page. So we know that this method was called. This one has not been called yet, but we will get to that. We will see this message come up a little bit later when we've got our click event on that button working. Okay, so what do you do with these methods? Here could be, okay, when this method gets called, it means that it's already been removed from the DOM. So I don't have access to its position in the DOM. I don't have access to it within the context of the page, the other elements that are on the page. I do have access to the document object. I do have access to the page. It's just that my Big Bang element has been removed. It's just a chance to do some cleanup or something like that. Connected, when we first add something to the page, you might want to set a default value for something. Like right now, I've got this light coral color. Maybe I wanted to add a default value for it. So we can say, if this dot color, if I've got that property, then we're going to set this dot color to, let's go for the old color that we were using before, cornflower blue. And there it is. So when this was added to the page, we set a default value for color. So this overrode what we had inside of here. So this is what's in the HTML. And when the page loaded, when the component was added to the page, so the constructor happens when the component's being built. This gets called when it's being added to the page. When it was being added to the page was after the constructor was called, because the constructor's called because we actually wrote the Big Bang in the HTML. So this was here. That's what triggered the constructor. And then the connected callback, that happens once it's already on the page. So we're overriding the value that's inside there. Okay, so just something to do. Inside of here, the slots themselves. So we have slot title, slot done. These are two things. We're accessing two slot elements that are inside our component. Come back up here. There's one slot and then a second one. So there's two slots here. If we want to add listeners to these two slots to know when the content inside them changes, we can do that inside the constructor. So let's find a reference to these things. So we're going to get a listener for the slot that we want, the one with the button. We're going to add our listener onto that, or get a reference to that one first of all. So let's say we'll call it our button slot. btn slot is this dot root dot query selector. And, well, it's some HTML reference. So I'll say p button slot. We'll just do it like that. So inside a paragraph, if there's a button, and inside the button there's a slot, that is going to find me the first slot that's inside of a button that's inside the paragraph. That's the one that I want to deal with. Okay, so I'm referencing that. Then I want to get the stuff that people put inside there. So I can actually access whatever this is being replaced with. So we can say that let HTML slot, I'll just use that as my variable for the stuff that's being put in there to replace the slot, and btn slot dot assigned nodes. Now this is a method that's going to return an array of all the nodes that were added into this. And I want the first one. I know that there's only going to be one. So assigned nodes gives us that array. And if we look inside of here, what is inside this slot? Or what is being put inside the slot? It's this. So the span itself, that is going to be the first thing that's inside of there. So there's that span. Now, we've got two methods. There's one that's which is assigned nodes. The other one is assigned elements. So if you're familiar with the difference between nodes and elements, nodes can be text nodes or elements. Elements are just elements. They're the tags, the HTML tags. So we've got two methods depending on what it is that we want to listen for. All right, now once we have this, we can add listeners. So the btn slot, that is this slot element right here, the one that's going to be replaced with HTML from the HTML page. Here, we can say I want to add an event listener, and the event that I'm going to listen for is slot changed. This method right here is only going to run when something gets put into there. So I can say, hey, I want HTML slot. Let's see what's inside that when the slot changes. Okay, so we're not changing it yet. We've got the default stuff that's happening when it's initially constructed. But in the JavaScript, on the page, if we were to change this span right here, if we were to change that thing with the slot attribute set to done, at that point, that is when this would be triggered. And again, we can use inside of here the assigned nodes and the assigned elements to find the bits and pieces that we want. Probably not going to use this one that much, but it's good to know that it's there just in case on those rare instances where you would need it. All right, so events. So we have our initial load, and with the constructor, we've got our added to the page with our connected callback, removed from page, disconnected callback, and then events. Inside of here, we're going to add an event to this button. So I can put a click listener on the button, on the paragraph, whatever it is that I want. But I'm going to say inside of here, this button, if this button gets clicked, I want to do something. Now, I'm not going to put that functionality up in main.js because the shadow DOM is closed, which means I can't access these things inside of here. This HTML is hidden from the outside world. Back on main.js, I can add a click listener to Big Bang. So to this thing as a whole, this Big Bang element, I can put listeners on that, but I cannot put listeners on the HTML that's generated by the Big Bang component. When this is closed, this is all sealed and hidden. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put an if statement around this. I'm going to say if HTML slot. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to check to see, hey, was there actually something added there? So if there was a node inside of here, so if slot was actually replaced with something, then I'm going to do this. I'm going to add the slot change listener. I'm going to add my click listener. So we'll say btn slot dot add event listener click. Now, if there was nothing added, if HTML slot is empty, that's when I want to do that cleanup that I was talking about earlier. I want to actually remove this thing. I want to get rid of that. So btn slot is p button slot. So this thing's parent is button, or its parent's parent is the paragraph. I can do either one. I'm going to keep it simple. I'm just going to say I'm going to remove the button. So if it doesn't exist, then btn slot parent element, that would be the button tag itself that's wrapped around the span with the word OK, I'm going to call remove. Okay, so there it is. We have our button, but if I come into my HTML, if I don't have this span OK, there, that little black rectangle is now gone. I don't have that as part of my page now. So I'm doing some cleanup. When the component is being built, I actually have something that can work whether or not the end user put this span in there. So if they don't have this there, it means they don't want a button. If they put it there, this is the label for the button. There it is. Okay. Great. So back in here, our click listener, what do we want to do with this? Well, I can write code here, but what I really want to do is I want to call whatever the user tells me to call. I want to get the value of action from here. So, hello, I want to run that function, which is in this code. And these two files are not connected. This was a module that was loaded separately so that we could build the Big Bang component. This is the script for my page. This could be coming from anywhere. This is the one that's accessing the DOM and doing all this stuff. So I invented the function that I want to use, called hello. Now, my action attribute right here, or the action property, the action attribute, is just a string. It's the word hello. It's not actually a reference to the function. It's just the name of the function. It's just the label, the string, the text, the characters that make up this name. So HELLO. That's what the value of the attribute is. And that's all you're allowed to have in attributes is strings. So how do we get from the string to an actual method that we want to call? And we want to also be able to pass this event, bubble it up to here so we can access it. Okay, so inside of here, I've got this .action. That is my property, which is going to be the word hello. If one exists, if somebody didn't put the attribute in there, this .action is going to be completely empty. So I'm going to create a variable here. I'm going to say I'll just say action equals. So this .action, we want to make sure that it actually has a value. So down here we've said, okay, yeah, set it to whatever the value is. But if it doesn't exist, it's not going to have anything inside there. We could go in here if it had a value and make sure that it's a valid one, but that's not really going to work for us. We need to check it here. This .action, okay, is there actually a string? It's not an empty string or it's not null. I want to know if on the window object, so this script right here has access to the window object. It's the parent, the global object that contains everything. Does it have a property called hello? And when you create a function like this, you are creating a property, a global property on the window object. It's on the global scope, so it's being added to the window object. So we can check to see if that, but really, we're already checking to see if there's something for the string. What I want to know now is if window this.action. So on the window object, something called this, assuming that this is not null or empty or undefined. So look on the window object and get the type of that thing. If it is equal to function, what we want to do is that is going to be the function that we're going to call. So I'm going to say window this.action, else I need a default function. I need something else that I can do. So I'm going to check to make sure that there is a property called this.action, and then on the window object this.action, its type, it's not going to be undefined, we're hoping. We want it to be function. And if it is, then that is what we assign to action, and that is what we're actually going to call right here, and we're going to pass in the event object, this click event. So we're passing it up to that hello function. Now, if it doesn't exist, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create right here a default function. I'm going to make it part of my component. I'm going to call it, let's say, default action for Big Bang button. There we go. So this dot this. So this dot default action for Big Bang button, that function right here is going to be our default one. If they don't provide us with an action attribute that has a valid value, then here we go. We're going to just do a console.log missing a valid action attribute value. Okay, so let's test this now. When we click on the button, this code will run. We should check the value of this to make sure that hello is something that exists on the window object. So if window hello exists, and if window hello is a function, then that is what we will assign to action, else we're going to call this one. All right, so if I click here, okay, so there it is, it's working, but it's not working when I click on the button. That's the issue right here. And that is because my click listener, I added it on the BTN slot, which is the span that wraps around the word OK. So I actually want to add it to the parent of button slot. This is just a design issue. So button slot dot parent element, that is the button that's wrapped around the slot. Now the entire button works. There we go. So we're good to go. Now the other function that we had in here, this one's going to have the example of removing it, just so we can demonstrate that working as well. So goodbye is the name of the function that we're going to put into here. Instead of hello, we will put goodbye. Now that is the function that's going to be called when we click on the button. It's going to run this code right here, which is going to call this goodbye function, which is going to find our Big Bang element on the page and remove it, which should trigger our disconnected callback and actually remove it from the page. There we go. Not that the disconnected callback was calling the remove from page. This is called after it's removed. The actual removal was being done right here. So the local function is removing the Big Bang element, and then because it's removed from the DOM, because it's removed from the page, that's what triggers this. All right, and that's it. That's events, that's behaviors, dealing with things being added or removed from the page, dealing with all the properties and attributes, being able to pass functions into your components that are defined within the user scripts themselves. So as long as you've got some documentation to tell them, this is the name of the function that you create locally that is going to happen when the person clicks on your button, you should be good to go. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments. I answer as many as I have time for. And as always, thanks for watching.